In the South, we would say, morning, y'all. I want to talk a little bit today about our automation journey that we took on 2 years ago at Duke. First, a little bit about Duke Energy. We're one of the largest utilities in the U.S. with 7.6 million customers in retail electric across 6 states, 1.6 million customers that are gas along 5 states, approximately $60 billion in market cap. On our website, and I'm not going to read this entire quote, but the Fortune 125 company is transforming its customers' experience, modernizing its energy grid, yada, yada, yada. The key here is transforming its customers' experience. If we're going to transform our customers' experience, then we in IT have to transform how we're doing business and delivering IT solutions for our business partners. We need to deliver high value, better, faster, cheaper. So with that, about 2 to 2.5 years ago, Duke started something called the Lift IT Transformation. We had about 4 towers in that: supply chain, lean, Agile, and DevOps. I'm not going to talk about supply chain and lean. We're focused on Agile and DevOps today. To see where we need to go, we need to kind of know where we came from. And we're still here in a lot of places today. So we're a very waterfall delivery organization, hierarchical, lots of blocks on org charts. Manual code builds, we did everything manually. Manual code builds, manual migrations, manual deploys. And as a utility company, we have a very low risk tolerance for failure. From a testing perspective, testing was something that happened way out in the future. People designed, built code. You tested right before you went to production. In performance testing, that was the last thing you did right before you went live to make sure you weren't going to kill anything, that you could actually go live. So where do we want to be? Our new vision is Agile, continuous integration, continuous delivery with a new DevOps pipeline. So what does that also mean for our durable teams? We want to empower our durable teams and product owners with the ability to make decisions at that level. Automate everything. Everything is in quotes. We know that we don't want to automate everything. We want to automate what makes sense. Fail fast and innovate. Remember, we're low risk, low tolerance for failure. Huge culture shift for all of these things for Duke Energy. From a testing perspective, we want to be at continuous testing, releasing every 2 weeks. We're not Amazon, we're not Google, we're probably not going to implement multiple times a day. But if we can get to where we can implement code into production every 2 weeks, that's a huge success for us, because many times we have quarterly releases, or sometimes even less than that for some of our software packages. So we want to automate, do continuous testing, continuous integration, continuous delivery, and we want to be able to launch that automated testing from anywhere along that DevOps pipeline, and particularly at code builds, migrations, kick off test plans to make sure the migrations worked, and schedule overnight unmanned testing with automation so that we can come in the morning, check the results, and have immediate feedback back to our developers. Also, as a part of this, continuous improvement, of course. Are we here yet? Absolutely not. Are we well on our way? Absolutely yes. So, as we began our testing journey, what we figured out is that we have to think differently about testing when we're talking about supporting Agile and DevOps. My team, which was a testing team, partnered with another project team, a large program at Duke, and in the 2-year journey that we've began, we've learned a lot of lessons. What's the best way to learn? You screw it up. We screwed up a lot of ways, and we learned and we innovated along the way, and now we have some best practices. So a lot of the things that you're going to see today in this slide, we're also going out and sharing with our internal teams that haven't started automating yet or haven't started doing Agile testing yet, so that they can maybe not hit some of the same potholes that we hit. So when we think differently about testing, that includes how we organize, how we plan, how we test, and what we test. So the first thing that we learned and it's something contrary to what Agile teaches us, is test planning is still critical. When you start your Agile journey, a lot of what you'll hear is we're focusing on working software, less documentation. Well, less documentation doesn't mean no documentation, and it doesn't mean you don't still need to plan. In fact, if you're doing Agile testing, you probably need to plan a little more than you used to with waterfall delivery. So if someone is telling you that testing is easy and Agile, I guarantee you that person is not in the trenches doing the work. We also didn't have a model to go by, so a lot of what we started with 2 years ago, it was trial and error. We made a lot of errors, but we learned a lot along the way. So an overall test strategy is still needed. The things that you used to have to worry about in waterfall delivery from a test planning standpoint, you still have to do in Agile. How many environments do I need? What's my migration path? What tools am I going to use? All the same things. The new thing is automation strategy. Duke Energy we're in our infancy with automation, but we have made huge leaps and bounds in the last 2 years. So it's probably been 2.5 years, I think, since we first started doing automated functional testing. And we did not start with Tricentis Tosca. We started with a third-party tool that was script-based. You can probably guess which one it was. But you need an automation strategy to be successful on any project, just like you need, and it needs to be a part of the overall test strategy. So the other lesson learned was incorporate test planning into backlog refinement, into your definition of ready and definition of done for your sprints. We were really good at figuring out, when we're doing our backlog grooming, what does that developer need to be successful? It needs requirements, it needs a few other things to be ready for that sprint. We knew we needed a test plan to test that code for the sprint, but what we didn't think about was test data. And if you're doing automation, what's the biggest pain in your ass? It's test data. And so we did not plan well for our sprints with testing. So we would be in the middle of our sprint, the developer is done, the tester's getting ready to test, and guess what? He's got no test data. Not only does he not have test data, but he doesn't have time to go create that test data now. It's too late. They're in the middle of the sprint. So what we had to do is back up, put a grid together and say, if you're this far back, 2 to 3 sprints out, 4 sprints out, here's what you need to be thinking from a testing perspective. By the time you get to that user story, your definition of ready should include not just what the developer needs, but the test data needs to be ready, the test plan needs to be ready, the data needs to be in the environment, or we don't accept that story into the sprint. Also, on the definition of done, just like you would have a tech lead review to make sure that the developed code has quality, meets standards, et cetera, you want somebody that's looking at that test script, manual or not, to make sure it's also good to go. Version control. We screwed this up. When you're in waterfall delivery, you still have this problem. It's just not transparent. You don't know you have the problem. Because if you're doing manual testing and testing is way out months away, what does a manual tester do when that script's not quite right? He adjusts on the fly. If the data doesn't quite work, he finds other data. If you're using automation, it ain't gonna work that way. So if your code is changing every 2 weeks, because we have 2-week sprints in most of our cases, then your test plans are also needing to change, manual or not, every 2 weeks. So you're in the mode of now having to figure out, how do I keep my test plans current with the code every 2 weeks? Have a version control strategy. It will save you a lot of heartache. The last thing is keep your test inventory current. It doesn't do any good to have 1,000 scripts, of which 300 are obsolete. Half of them don't work anymore because you haven't kept them current. So you need to keep that test inventory current. And you also need to make sure that you have traceability between, at least at a minimum, a traceability between your user stories or your requirements back to your test cases so you can identify what your coverage is. So a critical success factor for us in test planning was involve an automation architect up front, because they're going to start you off down the right path of what to automate and help work with the business and figure out what's critical. We started automating immediately. We didn't have a test data strategy. We didn't have an automation strategy. We just started automating. And consequently, our first go-around was we automated a lot of scripts or test cases, and part of them weren't even the ones we should have automated. Not only that, we didn't have the processes and procedures to keep them current when the code was changing. So there's a lot of setup that you need to do up front to get yourself set up for success. Automation architect is key. The next thing we learned was embed your testers in the Agile team. When we first started, we had our development Agile Scrum team, we had a test team, and then we had our automators in a third Scrum team. So as you can imagine, lots of handoffs, lots of knowledge transfer problems between all three of those teams. By the time the developer was done and it went to the testers, the developers were off in the next sprint. The testers are going, what did you change? We don't know. We need to know what to update our test plans to. So it caused a lot of context switching back for the Scrum team who's ready. They've already moved forward, and now they're being pulled back. So put your testers in the same Agile Scrum team. That means your manual testers, if you have them, and your automators. When we did that, what we found was organic knowledge transfer was happening. These guys, the developers and testers, are sitting side by side with each other. So a subtle culture shift also started happening. It became less of a developer versus tester, us versus them. As they're sitting and they're paired up side by side, the developers and the testers were actually communicating very well. The developer was getting feedback immediately from the tester, and the tester was even able to provide ideas on how to make the software better, more usable, because they're looking at it from a functional perspective, not a technical perspective. So that made more efficient testing and faster feedback for development. Now, where we want to be, and we're not there yet, is test-driven development, automated test-driven development. We want to get that automation all the way back at the most shift left that we can get it, which is when it's being built. So as we move and we get more mature and we start putting automated test-driven development in place, there's going to be a huge culture shock for our developers, because guess what? That developer-tester line now is going to blur, and those developers are going to be testing themselves. So we've got a huge change management issue ahead of us. We know it. We haven't started this yet, but it's on the horizon. It's on our roadmap. So critical success factor here, put your testers in your Agile team. Test automation. We are easily seeing 50 to 85% manual test case savings when we automate the test case. This is one of the metrics that we have in place. It's probably the only one that we look at. We don't try to do ROI. What we're capturing right now is if it took 2 hours for a person to execute a manual script, and now that automated script is 15 minutes, we're conservatively saying that that's, what did I say, 2 hours or 1 hour? I said 2 hours. That's an hour and 45 minutes of savings, right, on that test case. If I run it 10 times, I multiply it by 10. So we're seeing, since January of 2017, $9 million in savings. And we have just started our automation journey, right? Now that includes test automation, it includes some of the DevOps capabilities as well, but 65% of those savings is test automation. Automation is not something you do on the side, and this was a big faux pas for us when we started. We did not explain what automation is very well. So to people on the team that we were partnering with, it was a black box. They didn't know how it worked. We didn't explain how it worked. So if you don't know how something works, are you going to trust it? Nope. Are you going to understand the value of it? Nope. And so what we needed to come to was everybody on that team needs to understand how automation works, what gets automated, how to use it, and how to start thinking outside of the box. I have like 100 stories I can tell you on things that happen that kind of goes without saying, but one of the lessons learned is if you think it goes without saying, you should probably say it. So I'll give you an example. We had a test case that had 100 validation steps in it. And so out of those 100 validations, invariably we would run that script and maybe step 61 failed. Because the users saw the failure, the script doesn't work, it just failed. What they didn't take into account was 60 of those validations passed. So instead of going and testing 62 to 100 manually and figuring out what was wrong with number 61, they started back at the beginning and manually tested everything, right? Not very efficient. They didn't trust it. And not only did they not trust it, they saw failure as bad. So that was a huge culture shift as well, is getting folks to understand that failures with automation, it's a good thing. Something's wrong. You need to go figure it out. There's a data problem, there's a program problem, or there's a script problem. Don't ignore it, right? So early mistakes, but once they figured out that failures were good, it was a good thing. I had another story there that just slipped my mind. I'm sure I'll figure it out again in a minute. Automation must be maintained going forward to reap the benefits, and this gets back to setting your program up for success. You got to have the processes and procedures in place to, when that code changes, you have to know if this function changed, here's the 10 test cases, manual and automated, that need to be touched, that need to be kept current, or you're going to end up with a lot of obsolete test cases very quickly. So critical success factors for us with automation: have an automation champion. And what that means is, in this particular case, the partnering project that I was on, the delivery manager that was responsible, she was the automation champion. When people don't trust automation and they run into hurdles, test data, whatever the case may be, the tendency is to slide back into what your comfort zone is. Their comfort zone is manual testing. You got to have an automation champion that's going to push the envelope, that's not going to let folks slide back into their comfort zone. So 2 years ago, this team that I'm talking about hated automation, didn't understand it. If you told them today that they could not test with automation, they would be pissed. They love it now. They see the value. They understand it. I haven't cussed one time yet, have I? I'm keeping track. All right, test data strategy. You guys know, I did cuss once. Test data is a pain in the ass. And it's still a pain in the ass. But you got to have a test data strategy up front. What we were doing initially is we would create our test cases, and they were parameterized, and we'd put data in them, and they would run in the dev environment. We'd try to run them over in the test environment, which was next higher. They would fail. That's because the data is different. So we actually came up with a data strategy that allowed us to use the same test data in all the environments. Recognizing failures are good. Quality assurance inspector. So you want somebody that's going to keep you between the guardrails, make sure that you're automating according to your framework, that you're following standards, just to make sure that your automation is quality. All right. Our automation that we wanted to do, we put it in our backlog. So it was a user story, just like the enhancements, just like new delivery. Our test automation was also in the backlog. That helped us to understand and get prioritized the right automation. When we started automating, again, I said earlier, we automated the wrong things. We probably automated test cases that weren't even being used anymore, because we said, hey, give us your manual scripts, we'll automate them. We didn't know that part of the manual scripts weren't even being used anymore. So we did all this automation. Put it on your backlog. Work with your product owner to figure out your most critical functionality, your business priority, how many times you're going to use something. If something's going to run 5 times a week across multiple environments, that's a whole lot more valuable than something that's going to run once a year, right? Critical success factor here, automate the highest value. Test automation tools. When we started out, again, it was a 3rd generation tool. One of Tricentis's competitors, probably know which one it is. You needed programmers to be able to develop your automated scripts. We wanted to go enterprise-wide with our automation. You can't find enough programmers to develop that number of automated scripts. So what it did was make automation not scalable, just from a resource perspective. So we went out looking back in the fall of last year. We did an RFP, Tricentis won, and we implemented in March of 2018. We had our first training class in April. We've trained 100 people on automation since then. So we're going pretty fast. We found that it's easier to develop and maintain the test cases. We have testers now that have never automated a day in their life using Tricentis to automate test cases. Now, complex stuff, you're probably still going to need somebody with technical skills, but basic automation, these guys are doing it on their own. And guess what? They're supporting it as well. We don't have a centralized testing organization anymore. We stood that up 3 years ago. In fact, I worked with Accenture to stand it up. A year in, Agile came along, and everything we put together was no longer relevant. So right now, decentralized testing within the Agile Scrum using automation, which makes it easier to scale. With our old tool, we were never able to quite get to in-sprint automation. So we always had to have a manual test script first, and then later on, no earlier than the sprint after development, we were developing that automation. Now with Tricentis, we can actually build automation in script as the development is happening. So that's a big win for us. Critical success factor here, Tricentis Tosca. Go Mike. It's your sales guy. All right. I left this slide in because this is a typical environment layout for us, I guess, as a project when we do projects. In Agile, on the left side, you might have each Scrum team having their own development environment. And then at the end of every sprint, they migrate up to a test environment where it all comes together. The point I want to make on this slide is we developed regression testing that we had planned to run in our test environment where it all comes together. We are also running that same regression test bed every night, automated, unmanned, overnight, in our dev environments. Why? Because we can. We would never hire a manual test team to sit at night and do that keying and doing that testing. Because we've got it automated, we can run it in our dev environment every night. Do we expect failures? Absolutely. Somebody's in the code mucking with it, we expect it to fail. But if they inadvertently change something they didn't mean to, they're going to know about it the very next day. So that is another shift left for us, a good opportunity for increasing our speed. So critical success factor, we just talked about it. Automate, run those automated scripts every environment that you can. So how did we operationalize Agile testing? We have Agile coaches, there's theory land, and then there's operational, practical approaches and implementation of how to. We didn't have a good model to start with. But out of all the lessons learned and keeping our inventory current and putting our testers in the test team, what do those testers do? Remember, they're all in that same Agile Scrum team. First thing they do is execute the sprint testing for the new code that's being developed. The second thing they do is they log into the next higher environment and they run the regression scripts. So they're testing what was developed up to the current sprint, right? Not only that, those same people are planning for the next sprint. What am I going to do for my new code? What do I need to change in my regression bed right now because I just changed the code? So they're modifying the scripts to keep current with the code, and they're planning what's happening next time. And we're running those daily automated scripts or regression scripts everywhere we can. This is how you keep your testing on time. When we first started out, we did not do it this way because we had separate teams. We ended up having to stop our sprint work, catch up testing, and then restart our sprint work. If you do these things every sprint, you're going to be able to get in that continuous planning, continuous testing, continuous delivery mode. All right. This is something we don't do very well, risk-based testing. So our shorter delivery time frames, we're getting into our automation. We know we need to automate as much as we can. Continuous testing, continuous delivery, we're building out our DevOps pipeline. But what we tend to do is over-test. If we've got 1,000 scripts, we want to run every 1,000 of them, and some of them we run twice just because we're not clear that the first time it was successful. So, risk-based testing. Maximize your testing coverage with the minimal amount of testing effort. We're not there yet. It's something that's on our roadmap that we need to get to. So our overall critical success factor is continue to fail fast, continue to innovate, and improve along the way. Any questions? Either I did a really good job or I was really boring. I cannot.
Just gonna have to shout it out.
Okay, let's try to shout it out. So, what approach have you chosen to overcome the resistance of the manual testers to become automators?
At first, it was a hard thing to convince people to automate. But right now, we have several teams that have a lot of success stories, and we're able to get folks to want to automate because we're going and we're sharing those success stories everywhere we can. One of the things that we do is we have every 2 months, we have a DevOps coffee house. In that coffee house, we have stations, much like what you guys have set up out here, where we talk through our new capabilities, and we have success stories as a part of that coffee house. So we toot the horns of those people that are having successes. In this particular case, this project that we have, folks are lining up on that project to do Tricentis training. Okay, and then other teams are hearing that as well, and they're seeing the results. This team saved, and I'll talk about value versus savings. I'll just say savings right now. This team here saved over $800,000 in the first quarter alone with test automation. Now, what you have to be careful with is savings aren't necessarily hard savings. Managers like to hear financial dollars, and they go, 800,000 divided by 2080, I can get rid of however many people, right? So we've stopped using the word savings, and we're talking about value. So what's my value delivered?
One more question, Melinda?
Thanks. So excellent presentation, because that transition's really tough to Agile. I'm curious about, you talked about how you got rid of your centralized testing organizations, and then you were decentralizing the teams out to the developers, which is great, and that worked well for you. I'm curious, I've seen some organizations where they go back and have also a centralized organization to help guide best practices and continuous evolution. So I'm a little concerned about just ditching the
So we didn't ditch them.
Okay.
We still have a centralized testing organization. The object of that organization has changed. So at first it was, you've got a project, let us do your testing for you. And if we do automated scripts, we will maintain those as well. Now, what we're doing is we're taking those people, instead of centralized, we're placing that staff on the projects to create those durable teams. They may be there a while, because some of these projects are years long, right? So the plan going forward is to still have that testing center of excellence, but it's going to be focused on governance, light governance, making sure that we have testing best practices that we can give out to teams, but they're no longer going to be the centralized testing organization per se that we started with.
That's a great clarification. Thank you.
Renee, thank you so much. It was a fantastic presentation. I'd like to give you this.